The first thing you notice is not the city itself, but the sound coming from behind a thin apartment door. New York in 1907 is already noisy enough, with streetcars rattling, delivery wagons clattering over cobblestones and distant horns echoing between the buildings. But this sound is different. It is a quick, sharp chatter, a high little squeal, the scrape of something light scrambling up wood and fabric. For a moment, the city noise dips, and in that brief pause, you can hear it clearly, like a small, wild heartbeat hiding behind plaster and paint. Outside, the city is dreaming of progress. Elevated trains thunder above the streets, their iron skeletons slicing the sky. Electric lights glow in shop windows, advertising the future in bright, buzzing letters. In parlors and hotel lobbies, the latest scandals and inventions are discussed over coffee and cigarettes. And tucked inside these conversations, like a curious little side note, there is a story that keeps appearing in the newspapers and gossip columns. A story about New Yorkers who have decided that ordinary pets are no longer interesting enough. It is the story of the monkey craze. Tonight, we are going to stay with that story for a long time. We will walk slowly through the streets and stairwells of 1907 New York. Step into pet shops that smell of straw and sawdust. Listen in on quiet arguments at dinner tables and loud laughter at parties where a small, frightened animal is passed from hand to hand. We will sit for a while in the minds of the people who thought it was a charming idea to bring a piece of the jungle into a fifth-floor apartment. And as we drift toward sleep, we will begin to understand why this little craze was at once fashionable, ridiculous, and just a bit sad. Before we settle in, though, a small favor. If you enjoy these long, drowsy journeys into forgotten corners of history, it helps more than you might think if you gently tap the like button and subscribe, so you can find your way back here the next time you need a calm voice and a strange story to fall asleep to. And I am curious, as always, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it there right now? You can whisper it to yourself, or tell me in the comments if you are still awake. Now, let us step back into 1907, out of the hallway and down the stairs, and look at the city that made room, however briefly, for monkeys on leashes and on shoulders. New York at the beginning of the 20th century is a city in the middle of a growth spurt. Buildings climb higher each year, steel and stone stacked on top of old wooden dreams. The streets are crowded with people who were not here a generation ago. Immigrants from Europe, families from the countryside, ambitious young men and women who have come to the city because they believe or hope that something better is possible here. There are neighborhoods where the languages of half a dozen countries overlap and blend, and streets where the signs in the sawed windows are so new that the paint is still drying. Alongside this restless human movement, there is another kind of expansion. The city is filling up with things, new technologies, new toys, new fashions, electric lights, phonographs, motion pictures flickering in dark little theaters. In a world that is suddenly full of inventions, people become hungry for novelty. They begin to search not only for new machines, but for new sensations, new experiences, new ways to show that they are modern and just a little bit ahead of everyone else. This hunger reaches into everyday life in small but telling ways. Clothing styles change more quickly. Home decor becomes a kind of message, announcing taste and status to anyone who steps through the door. Even pets begin to shift from practical companions to decorative symbols. A dog is no longer just a guard or a working animal. It can be a statement about who you are. A cat can be a sign of refinement or of eccentricity, depending on how you talk about it and where it sleeps. In this atmosphere, the idea of owning an exotic animal slips quietly from the circus tent and the menagerie into the private imagination. People begin to wonder what it would be like to have not just a dog or a cat, but something more unusual walking beside them or waiting at home. A parrot that talks, a raccoon that dips its food in water before eating it, a monkey that can sit on your shoulder and, in the right light, almost pass for a tiny, badly behaved child. Steamships bring these animals into the port along with coffee, rubber, and crates of fruit. Somewhere in the darkness below deck, in cages and crates, there are animals that have never seen snow or heard the echo of their own calls against tall buildings. When the ships are unloaded, some of these animals are taken to zoos and traveling shows. Others follow quieter paths, slipping into the city through the back doors of pet shops and the side doors of private dealers. If you walk into one of these pet shops on a chilly morning in 1907, you would feel the change in the air as soon as the door closes behind you. The sharp smell of coal smoke outside gives way to the warm, crowded scent of animals. Wooden floors creak underfoot. Rows of cages line the walls, some filled with familiar shapes, others with strange, shifting ones that make your eyes adjust. There are dogs here, of course, from small lap dogs with enormous eyes to larger breeds whose paws seem much too big for the narrow aisles. There are cats watching everything from high shelves with the kind of calm suspicion cats have worn for thousands of years. Canaries hop and sing in hanging cages, bright little lamps of color in the dimness. But if you look more closely, you will see, in a corner or near the counter, a few small cages that draw more than their share of glances. Inside those cages sit monkeys. They are not all the same kind. Some have long, curled tails and delicate hands that look almost like little gloves. Others are more compact, with rounder faces and short, quick movements. Their eyes are dark and alert, taking in every figure that moves through the shop. When someone approaches, they might press their faces against the bars, or recoil to the back of the cage, or reach out with sudden daring to touch the air just beyond the metal. For many New Yorkers, this is their first close look at such an animal. They might have seen monkeys in illustrations, or in cramped cages at traveling shows, or darting across the stage in a vaudeville act. But here, the monkey is not a distant performer. It is a possible purchase. Shopkeepers understand this. They have seen a trend building, fed by newspaper stories and word of mouth. A lady from one of the better neighborhoods has been seen stepping out of a carriage with a monkey on a chain, its little jacket buttoned neatly up the front. A gentleman in a fashionable hat has been spotted strolling through the park with a primate perched on his shoulder, drawing stares and whispers. These stories spread through the city like dropped ink through water. The newspapers themselves begin to comment on it, half amused, half disapproving. Columns speak of a monkey craze among certain circles, a sudden enthusiasm for keeping these nimble creatures in homes that are barely large enough for their human occupants. Some articles take a light tone, describing the antics of the animals and the indulgent laughter of their owners. Others take a sharper approach, hinting at cruelty, foolishness, or danger. For the people at the center of it all, the reasons for joining the craze are as varied as the city itself. Some are genuinely fascinated by animals and want something unusual. something that challenges the routine of their days. Some are drawn by the status that comes from owning a creature most people only read about. Having a monkey in your parlor is a way of saying, without words, that you have reached a certain level of wealth and sophistication, or at least that you wish to be seen that way. In drawing rooms where the curtains are heavy and the carpets are thick, a monkey might be introduced as a charming novelty. Guests arrive, their coats taken by servants, their hats carefully stored, and before they can settle fully into polite conversation, there is a sudden commotion as a small animal darts across the back of a sofa. There are gasps, then laughter, then a flurry of questions. Where did you get it? What does it eat? Does it really understand you? The owner smiles, half proud, half nervous, as the monkey chooses exactly the worst moment to bare its teeth or fling a piece of fruit at the chandelier. In crowded tenement buildings, the story looks different. Every square foot is precious, privacy is rare, and walls are thin. Here, a monkey is not so much a status symbol as a wild card. Some people keep them in hopes of making money, training them to perform simple tricks on the street or in taverns. Others are drawn in by the same promise of novelty, only to discover that their neighbors are less enchanted by the noise, the smell, and the occasional escaped animal sprinting down the hallway. In every case, the same basic truth emerges slowly. Monkeys are not designed for human apartments. They are clever, curious, restless. They need space to climb and explore. In the narrow rooms of 1907 New York, their energy has nowhere to go but into mischief. Window latches become puzzles to solve. Tablecloths become ropes to pull. Bottles, in their eyes, exist mostly to be knocked over and investigated for interesting sounds. The city watches all of this with its usual mixture of patience and impatience. Street children chase escaped monkeys through alleyways, laughing as the animals scramble up drain pipes and fire escapes. Policemen grumble as they are called to retrieve a runaway pet from a lamppost. Doctors and neighbors worry aloud about bites and scratches, about diseases that might cross from animal to human in tight, unventilated rooms. And yet, for a time, the craze continues. More ships arrive. More animals are sold. More stories are told in parlors and printed in papers. The idea lingers that to be modern, to be daring, to be just a step ahead of your friends, you might need not just a telephone or an automobile, but a monkey sitting on your windowsill, watching the city with sharp, unblinking eyes. Tonight, as we move deeper into this story, we will stay close to those eyes. We will listen to the soft clink of chains and the rustle of little bodies in straw. We will follow the path from ship to shop to sitting room and feel how thin the line can be between fascination and folly. For now, you can let the picture of that hallway return to your mind. The door, the faint rattling of glass, the strange, small sounds that do not quite fit the building that contains them. If your own room is quiet enough, you might imagine that, somewhere far away in time, another listener is lying awake in a narrow bed in 1907, listening to the exact same sounds and wondering whether this whole monkey craze was really such a good idea. If you were to open a newspaper in New York in 1907 and let the pages fall open at random, you would find the city laid out in columns of crowded ink. There would be serious news, of course, politics, strikes, speeches, accidents. There would be the stock market, printed in patient little numbers. There would be advertisements for soaps and patent medicines, for corsets that promise to reshape the body and tonics that promise to reshape the soul. And then, tucked between these heavier items, there would be the smaller pieces, the strange little stories, short paragraphs with sly headlines, reporting on the odd behavior of your fellow citizens. The woman who insisted on walking her pig like a dog, the man who tried to smuggle a case of fireworks onto a streetcar, the gentleman who swore his canary could predict the weather. The monkey craze slips into the papers through these side doors, not as front page material, but as the kind of thing readers shake their heads at over breakfast. One morning, there is a brief note about a monkey that escaped from an uptown apartment and caused a minor riot in the street below. Passers-by stopped to watch as the animal clambered along a balcony rail, chattering in what the reporter describes as an agitated manner, before leaping onto a nearby awning and then onto the shoulders of an unfortunate man who just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The article treats it as a comedy, lingering on the way the man's hat went flying into the road and had to be retrieved from under a carriage wheel. Another day, a different column mentions a lady of fashion arriving at a hotel with a monkey dressed in a tiny coat, the animal perched on her arm like a peculiar accessory. The writer cannot resist a few jokes about how the creature seemed more interested in the sugar bowl than in polite society, and how some guests were charmed while others sat rigidly in their chairs, pretending not to be alarmed when the monkey darted close to their hair. There are more serious notes, too. A small item toward the bottom of one page reports an injury. A child bitten while trying to play with a neighbor's pet monkey. The description is brief, almost brisk. The child was treated by a doctor, the animal confined. The article does not dwell on the blood or the fear or the arguments that must have followed in that hallway. It is one small story among many, and yet it hints at a shadow behind the laughter. Journalists, like everyone else in the city, are fascinated by novelty. Some of them lean into the humor, calling the monkey craze a sign of the times, proof that modern life has become so crowded and strange that even the pets are imported curiosities. Others adopt a more skeptical tone, asking pointed questions about whether wild animals belong in cramped apartments, whether the pursuit of fashion has gone too far. As you read through these pieces in your mind, you can almost hear the voice of a columnist late at night, hunched over a desk, dipping a pen in ink and trying to decide what this all means. Is it simply another fad, like a new style of hat or a popular song that will be forgotten in a year? Or does it reveal something deeper about the city's restless appetite, its tendency to reach for more without fully understanding what it is taking? While the papers comment and joke, the practical work of supplying the craze continues elsewhere, in places where no one is writing clever headlines. Down by the waterfront, the air is heavy with salt and coal and the smell of cargo. Crates are unloaded from great steamships that have crossed the ocean, their hulls carrying goods from colonies and distant ports. Bales of rubber, sacks of coffee, boxes of tea. In the shadow of these respectable cargoes, there are other boxes, smaller, with slats that let in air and just enough light for something inside to move. If you stand a little apart and listen, you might hear faint sounds from these crates that are not the groaning of wood or the creak of rope. A muffled squawk, a restless scrabble. The sharp, questioning chirp of an animal far from the trees it was born among. It is in these boxes that the monkeys arrive, bundled into the flow of commerce like any other commodity, counted and invoiced and signed for. Animal dealers, importers, and middlemen meet the ships. They know, in the way that people who work at the edge of legality often know, how far they can push and when to speak softly. Papers are exchanged. Money changes hands. The animals are moved to quieter places, back rooms, basements, makeshift holding areas that smell of straw, metal, and fear. Some of the monkeys are destined for zoos, some for traveling shows, some for private collections behind high garden walls, and some, increasingly, for the pet trade. There is no grand plan behind the monkey craze. It grows from many small decisions, each one made by someone thinking of profit, or entertainment, or social standing. A dealer hears that a certain kind of animal is popular among the wealthy, so he orders a few more from a contact overseas. A pet shop owner notices that customers linger longer in front of the cages holding monkeys than they do in front of the ones holding parakeets. A family with more money than sense decides that a monkey will make their apartment more interesting, more memorable to guests. In drawing rooms where the wallpaper is thick and the carpets are soft, a monkey might be introduced with the same pride as a new painting. Guests gather around, their voices rising in a chorus of admiration and nervous laughter. The monkey, unused to so many eyes, flits from shoulder to curtain rod, sometimes pausing to stare back at the humans as if they are the ones on display. A hand reaches out, cautiously, to offer a morsel of food. The animal takes it with surprising delicacy, and for a moment everyone relaxes. Then, just as suddenly, the monkey bares its teeth, or pulls at an earring, or seizes a delicate piece of jewelry and bolts across the room with it. There is a pattern to these evenings. First comes delight, then a little unease, then the subtle strain of having something unpredictable in a room that was carefully arranged to be predictable. A broken glass can be replaced. A scratched hand can be bandaged. But over time, the household begins to adjust itself around the animal, setting things higher, closing doors more firmly, watching guests more closely. What began as a charming novelty becomes a constant negotiation. In humbler quarters, the story is harsher. There are tenement rooms where a monkey is kept in a small cage because there is simply nowhere else to put it. The animal's world is reduced to a few inches of movement, a pair of hands that feed it when there is time, a few scraps of cloth or straw for comfort. Children might tease it through the bars, or stare at it the way they would stare at a strange machine. The grown-ups are too busy working, worrying about rent and food, to think much about what the animal feels. Sometimes, the monkey is taken out of its cage and brought into the street as a kind of living performance. A man, or a boy, barely older than a child, stands on a corner or walks through a crowded space with the animal perched on his shoulder or clinging to his coat. It has been taught a trick or two: a little bow, a wave, a turn of the head on command. A small tin cup rattles in its hands as it moves from person to person, collecting scattered coins from those who are amused, or moved, or simply looking for an excuse to pause. The monkey craze, viewed from above, might look like a single phenomenon. But down at street level, it is many overlapping stories, many different kinds of bargains being made, between humans and animals, between curiosity and responsibility, between the glittering idea of owning something rare and the daily reality of caring for a wild creature that does not understand why its world smells like smoke and cabbage and the sour sweat of stairwells. As the year wears on, more incidents find their way into conversation. A neighbor is woken up at dawn by shrill chattering above the ceiling, only to discover that the family upstairs has acquired a new pet. A child comes home wide-eyed from a visit to a cousin's house because there was a monkey there that jumped on the table and stole a piece of bread right out of an adult's hand. Someone's Sunday best is ruined by a small dirty paw. Someone's nerves are worn thin by the constant clinking of chain links against metal. Doctors begin to be asked questions they were not asked before. Is a monkey dangerous? Can its bite make you sick? Is it safe for it to be near a baby? Some physicians answer cautiously, pointing out that all animals can carry disease, that caution is advisable, that perhaps this is not a wise trend. Others shrug, more preoccupied with the very human illnesses crowding their waiting rooms. Tuberculosis, influenza, accidents at work. Compared to these, a chattering pet might seem like a small concern. Animal welfare groups, still relatively young in their organized form, watch the monkey craze with a mixture of sorrow and frustration. They had already been fighting the mistreatment of horses, the neglect of dogs left to starve, the thoughtless cruelty shown to working animals that are pushed past their limits. Now, they see a new kind of suffering appearing, wrapped in fashion and novelty instead of poverty or habit. They write pamphlets, give speeches, try to remind people that a creature from distant forests cannot thrive on a chain in a city yard. Some listen, many do not. There is always something new to talk about in New York, some fresh distraction, some other crisis or amusement calling people's attention away. At the edges of all this, the monkeys themselves move through their short, bewildering lives. They do not know what a craze is. They know that they were once somewhere else, full of green smells and rustling branches, and that now they are here, where the world is hard and loud and crowded with angles instead of curves. They know that their bodies want to climb and leap and explore, and that the spaces they have been given are too small for that impulse to ever really rest. When they lash out, it is often from fear or frustration. When they cling, it is often because the nearest human shoulder is the only high place left. They learn the rhythms of the households they live in. When food arrives, when lights are turned down, when everyone's voices get softer or sharper, they are intelligent enough to sense stress and boredom, but not to understand why everything feels just slightly wrong. The monkey craze reaches its peak quietly, without a single defining moment. There is no grand announcement, no particular day when everyone decides that monkeys are the new must-have accessory. Instead, there is a gradual thickening of stories, a sense that in certain circles, at certain parties, in certain neighborhoods, these animals have become part of the scenery. And just as quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, there is the beginning of a turning. Sometimes it is as simple as exhaustion. A family grows tired of the mess, the noise, the constant need to watch both fragile objects and fragile guests. A landlord complains. A neighbor threatens to call the authorities. The monkey is sold, or given away, or quietly sent back through the network of dealers and importers to end up somewhere else, not always somewhere better. Other times, the turning comes from fear. A bite that becomes infected, a scratch too close to the eye, a moment when the animal's strength surprises someone who thought of it only as a toy. Warnings carry more weight when they are attached to real pain. The tone of the newspaper stories shifts slightly, from indulgent amusement to something more wary. There are still those who keep their monkeys and care for them as best they can, who try to create some kind of compromise between the animal's needs and the limits of city life. But the fashion itself begins to feel less fresh, less clever. New trends rise to replace it. People's attention moves on to automobiles, to new dances, to scandals and shows. The monkey craze, like so many crazes, begins to fade. From the vantage point of the present, this whole episode might seem almost absurd, a footnote in the larger history of a city that had far more serious things to worry about. But if you look closely, you can see in it a pattern that repeats again and again in different forms. A wild thing is turned into an ornament, a symbol, a toy. People fall in love with the idea of it, with the feeling it gives them to own something rare. They think less about the compromises hidden underneath that feeling. As you lie here listening, you can let the noise of 1907 New York rise and fall in your mind. The clang of streetcars, the shouts of drivers, the calls of vendors, and behind one door, then another, the thin, bright thread of monkeys chattering in rooms that were never meant for them. For a brief moment in time, their voices are part of the city's unfinished song. By the spring of 1907, the monkey craze had become familiar enough that it no longer surprised the city, only wearied it in small, persistent ways. Letters arrived at newspaper offices from readers who had grown tired of the novelty. Some wrote with dry humor, complaining that it had become impossible to visit certain homes without risking a paw print on a coat or a pawful of hair pulled from a careful style. Others were sharper, describing sleepless nights in thin-walled buildings where the chattering and scraping from above or below never seemed to end. Public officials began to take more notice. Police precincts kept small ledgers of incidents, and in some of those ledgers, the word monkey appeared more often than might be expected. A patrolman noted a call to remove an escaped animal from a laundry yard, the creature having knocked over a basket and sent clean shirts tumbling into the mud. Another entry recorded an altercation between neighbors that started over a bitten finger and escalated into accusations about noise, filth, and the right to quiet after dark. Health departments, already stretched by outbreaks of disease in crowded neighborhoods, faced new questions about what kinds of animals should be allowed in small apartments and lodging houses. There were no clear, widely enforced rules about exotic pets, only scattered regulations that had never imagined a future in which monkeys would be perched on windowsills, peering down at the streets like small, restless landlords. Some officials argued that the animals posed a direct risk, carrying unknown illnesses from distant climates. Others pointed out that the city was already full of rats, stray dogs, and overflowing cesspools, and that a few dozen pet monkeys were hardly the most pressing concern. Still, memos were written and circulated. Suggestions were made, if not always enforced. Landlords began to add vague clauses to rental agreements about unusual animals and disturbing nuisances. Boarding house notices, pinned up in entryways, reminded tenants that the premises were not suitable for wild creatures, large or small. The language was imprecise, but the intention was clear enough. Some buildings simply refused new tenants who arrived with wooden crates that seemed to shift and mutter on their own. In the city's more polished districts, the reaction was subtler. The monkey, once a conversation piece, began to feel less like a daring bit of modernity and more like an awkward guest who had stayed too long. Hostesses who had once encouraged visitors to admire their exotic pets started to dread the inevitable chaos. A cup knocked from a saucer, a fruit bowl overturned, a shriek when the animal's quick fingers found a brooch or chain. Parties became quieter when the monkey was brought into the room, the laughter edged with nerves instead of delight. Some households adjusted by retreating from display. The animal that had been allowed to roam freely among upholstered chairs and embroidered cushions was confined more often to a side room or a cage, brought out only when a particularly insistent guest asked to see it. In that side room, the air grew stale. Toys appeared, improvised from discarded objects, a length of rope tied to a hook, a stuffed sock, a wooden spoon. But even the most patient attempts at enrichment could not turn four walls into a forest. Servants, who did much of the daily work of living with these animals, had their own opinions. In private, they complained to one another about bites and scratches, about the extra cleaning, about the way a monkey could demolish a carefully prepared tea table in the time it took to fetch a tray from the kitchen. Some grew fond of the animals in spite of this, seeing in their bright eyes a kind of trapped intelligence. Others felt nothing but resentment, regarding the creatures as one more unnecessary complication in lives already filled with other people's demands. In the poorer quarters, where the line between performing animal and family member was often blurred, the fatigue took different forms. Children who had once been thrilled by the presence of a monkey in the home began to flinch at the sudden sharp movements and the occasional nip. Adults watched the small injuries accumulate and wondered how much longer the experiment could continue. The money earned on the street with the help of a performing animal sometimes failed to cover the cost of food and care. A monkey that might have seemed like a financial opportunity in the beginning could become a burden when coins grew scarce. There were also the whispers, the stories told secondhand in doorways and on stoops. A monkey sold for a fraction of its purchase price to a man who loaded animals into a wagon and would not quite say where he took them. An exhausted owner leaving a pet at a market stall with vague promises to return, then failing to appear. A creature found shivering in an alley, its fur patchy, its eyes cloudy with confusion and fear. These stories did not make it into the newspapers as often as the lively, amusing tales. Yet they were part of the same arc, shadows cast by the bright flame of a fleeting fashion. In these months, the pet shops that had profited from the craze began to adapt. Some of them reduced the number of monkeys they ordered, sensing that demand was softening. A few tried to rebrand their remaining primates as rarities, lowering their voices and raising their prices, as if scarcity itself could turn an uncertain market into a profitable one. Others shifted their emphasis entirely, filling their windows with more docile creatures, puppies with oversized paws, kittens too sleepy to cause much trouble, canaries whose songs did not involve any climbing at all. Behind the counters, shopkeepers talked in guarded tones about the craze having run its course. They remembered earlier waves of enthusiasm for other animals, tiny dogs carried in pockets, unusual breeds of cat, bright feathers worn in hats, and recognized the same pattern. First curiosity, then imitation, then a crest of popularity, and finally the quiet retreat as the city turned its gaze somewhere else. What lingered, even as the visible signs of the monkey craze began to diminish, was a residue of stories and impressions. Children who had once glimpsed a monkey peering out from behind the lace curtains of a parlor window carried that memory into adulthood, unsure whether they had imagined it. Clerks in offices recalled glimpses of a small, solemn primate sitting on a windowsill while its owner smoked, and read the evening paper. Policemen told new recruits about the time they had coaxed an escaped animal down from a lamppost with a piece of bread. The creature's hands surprisingly gentle as it accepted the offering. There were also the marks left on the built environment, though these were harder to see. Scratches on wooden door frames at a height no dog could have reached. Tiny dents in mantelpieces where a curious creature had tested its teeth. Stains on wallpaper in shapes that did not quite match the usual smudges of human hands. These were the very smallest of fossils, traces of lives out of place. For the monkeys themselves, time moved differently. Their lives in the city were often short, compressed by stress and confinement. Some succumbed to illnesses that thrived in damp rooms and unventilated cages. Others were injured in falls or in panicked scrambles away from sudden noises that human ears barely registered. A few, through luck or the unusual patience of their keepers, lived long enough to become fixtures in the households that had initially acquired them out of fashion or curiosity. In such rare cases, a kind of uneasy companionship sometimes settled in. A monkey would learn the patterns of the day, waiting for certain sounds that signaled meals or moments of attention. It might curl up in a familiar spot when lamps were turned down, its small body moving in rhythm with the breathing of the humans who shared the room. Affection could grow in that shared routine, though it was always threaded with the knowledge that the animal was still, at heart, something wild. Its sudden startles, its flashes of aggression, its intent, watchful eyes, all spoke of a world older and larger than any city. The city itself, always moving forward, did not pause to decide whether the monkey craze had been a moral failure or merely a strange detour. New technologies and entertainments arrived in rapid succession. Automobiles multiplied on the streets, bringing with them a new kind of danger and fascination. Motion picture theaters became gathering places for crowds seeking stories larger than their own. Airplanes, still a novelty, drew eyes upward toward a different kind of sky. In that shifting landscape, the fashion for keeping monkeys as pets slipped into the background. It remained, for a time, as a topic for reminiscence, jokes in columns about those ridiculous monkey years, quiet confessions between friends that a certain animal had been missed, despite everything, after it was gone. Twinges of guilt when old cages were repurposed for birds or stored in attics, their bars still bearing the marks of small, insistent hands. Gradually, regulations began to harden, not always as direct responses to the monkey craze, but as part of a broader attempt to control the movement and keeping of animals within the city. Permits were required for certain species. Restrictions were placed on what could be brought into tenement buildings. Zoos and formal collections asserted their role as the proper homes for exotic creatures, framing themselves as guardians rather than showmen. The memory of the craze became something that belonged to a particular generation, an odd chapter tucked between more serious histories of labor struggles, architectural booms, and political battles. It was rarely given its own headline in later accounts of the era. More often, it surfaced in anecdote, a line in a diary, a mention in a letter, a sidelong note in a biography describing the peculiar habits of an eccentric aunt or uncle who once kept a monkey in a room above a bustling street. Seen from a distance, the 1907 monkey craze was small compared to the great forces that shaped the city. It did not change the course of elections, or halt the construction of bridges, or alter the path of influenza. Yet within its brief span, It revealed something about the texture of life at that time. It showed how quickly a restless, crowded place could seize on a new idea and carry it to extremes, how thin the boundary could be between amusement and harm when living beings were involved. In the quiet of private rooms, long after the last monkey had vanished from a particular building, traces of the experience remained in the minds of those who had lived alongside them. There were recollections of hands that were surprisingly warm, of eyes that seemed to understand more than expected, of moments of shared stillness when human and animal rested together in a patch of weak sunlight. There were also recollections of broken objects, frightened children, angry words shouted in narrow hallways. All of it, the tenderness and the trouble alike, folded into the larger history of a city constantly experimenting with new ways of being modern. The craze rose, shimmered briefly in the public imagination, and then dispersed like smoke, leaving behind a few thin newspaper clippings and the faintest of echoes in old buildings that would, in time, be torn down or transformed. In that sense, the monkey craze of 1907 became one more example of the way a city could briefly invite the wild inside, turning it into a spectacle, an ornament, a possession, and then, gradually, admit that the bargain had never been entirely fair. Long before 1907, the idea of owning an exotic animal had already taken root in the minds of people far from the forests and shores where those animals were born. In the great houses of Europe, there had been private menageries, collections of creatures gathered from colonies and distant coasts to walk behind iron bars on neatly raked gravel. Visitors would stroll along the rows of cages, pointing and whispering, pleased to be startled by the presence of something that did not belong in their climate or on their continent. Those grand collections were symbols of power and reach. To display a leopard or a monkey in a cold northern garden was to show that ships and soldiers and merchants could extend a nation's will across oceans. In paintings and travelogues, the presence of exotic animals signaled a kind of mastery over the natural world, even if that mastery consisted largely of keeping uncomfortable creatures alive in the wrong place. By the time such ideas filtered down into the busy, crowded life of New York, they had been changed by scale and circumstance. The city did not have room for private menageries in most of its buildings, nor the climate or space for elaborate enclosures. What it did have was a web of trade routes and a growing appetite for curiosities. Where a noble family once displayed exotic animals in a park, a prosperous city family could display a smaller, portable version in a parlor. The monkey craze sat at the intersection of these older traditions and the newer culture of consumer goods. The same forces that filled shop windows with imported fabrics and manufactured toys also made it possible for someone of modest means to consider owning a sliver of the tropics. Catalogs and advertisements hinted at this possibility without always naming it directly, folding images of animals into illustrations of happy homes. A lamp here, a rug there, and in the corner, almost as an afterthought, a creature in a cage. The trade that supplied such animals depended on networks that stretched far beyond the city. Hunters and trappers in one part of the world supplied middlemen, who in turn sold to exporters who packed crates for the long journey by sea. At each step of the chain, the animals were transformed a little more from individuals in a habitat to items in a ledger. Their species, age, and health became lines on a manifest. Their lives folded into a list alongside bolts of cloth and boxes of machinery. In the hold of a ship, the world narrowed. The air grew thick with the smell of salt, tar, and the cramped breath of many living things. Darkness, broken only by the occasional lantern and the shifting light that filtered down through hatches, became the background against which the animals moved, or did not move. Seasickness, fear, and unfamiliar food took their toll. Some creatures survived, others did not. Those that did emerge into the harsh light of a foreign port did so already changed by the journey, their strength and spirits tested. Once in the city, their paths diverged. Some were destined for zoological parks, where they would be studied, observed, and held up as educational specimens. Others were acquired by traveling shows, adding a hint of far-off places to a program of acrobats, musicians, and clowns. A smaller number slipped quietly into the pet trade, their crates unloaded behind shops where the front windows displayed more familiar animals. The people who encountered monkeys at the end of this chain rarely thought about its beginning in detail. The sight of a small animal pressing its hands against the bars of a cage in a shop filled with straw and birdsong did not automatically conjure up images of forests, traps, and ocean voyages. For many city dwellers, the monkey appeared as if it had been created by the shop itself, part of its atmosphere of curiosities and possibilities. Price played its own subtle role in shaping who joined the craze. A monkey was not cheap, but it was not so ruinously expensive as to be entirely out of reach for the middle classes. In a time when people were already stretching their budgets to purchase pianos, sewing machines, phonographs, and, for the very fortunate, automobiles, the cost of an exotic pet could be framed as another investment in domestic life. It was a choice to allocate money toward spectacle instead of savings, toward stories instead of stability. Class shaped not only who could acquire a monkey, but also what life that monkey would lead. In a wealthy home, there might be a warm room, plenty of food, and at least some effort to provide stimulation. In a cramped building where every inch of space was contested, the animal's presence could feel like a constant intrusion. Yet in both cases, the same tension appeared. A wild creature placed in an environment designed for human routines and expectations. Season after season, the city reminded both humans and animals that it operated on its own terms. In the heat of summer, when the air in tenement rooms turned thick and unmoving, monkeys panted and paced in their cages, their fur damp and their movements slower. The shade of a curtain or a spot near an open window might become a treasured refuge. The smells of the street, rotting fruit, horse manure, hot metal, rose through the air, blending with the musk of animals and the sour tang of close quarters. In winter, sharp cold found its way through cracks in walls and around window frames. Apartments were heated unevenly, some too warm, and others barely heated at all. A creature accustomed to dense foliage and filtered light looked out at a world of bare branches and gray skies and did not understand the reason for the chill. Its keepers added extra cloth to its sleeping area or moved the cage closer to the stove, but there were limits to how well human solutions could reconcile a tropical body with a northern city. The rhythm of human work cut across these patterns. People left for jobs in the morning, locking doors behind them, and the monkeys were left alone for long stretches of time. They filled those hours with whatever activity was available: climbing, chewing, unraveling fabrics, testing the strength of knots and latches. A single oversight, a window left unlatched, a cage door not quite shut, could turn that restlessness into an escape. When such escapes happened, they became small events in the streets. A monkey scrambling along a row of clotheslines might send shirts and undergarments flapping like startled birds. An animal perched on a roof edge could paint a sharp silhouette against the sky, drawing eyes upward from whatever troubles occupied them at ground level. Children might treat the scene as an unexpected performance. Adults measured the situation with more complex emotions, somewhere between amusement and anxiety. There were efforts, here and there, to impose some order on these encounters. Building owners posted notices reminding tenants to keep their animals under control, the wording vague enough to cover both barking dogs and chattering monkeys. Some shopkeepers put up discreet signs asking customers not to bring pets inside after one too many incidents involving an excited primate and a display of fragile goods. Streetcar conductors refused passage to owners whose animals seemed particularly agitated, unwilling to risk chaos in an already cramped vehicle. Yet for all these minor attempts at control, the heart of the craze remained in private spaces. It lived in the decision to reach into a cage in a shop and lay money down on a counter. It persisted in the moment when a door closed behind a new owner and an animal took its first uncertain steps into an apartment filled with furniture, fabrics, and unfamiliar smells. It echoed in the sounds that filtered through walls, the quick patter of small feet, the rattle of objects knocked askew, the half-stifled exclamations of surprise and frustration. In some homes, diaries and letters captured fragments of these experiences. A line about the creature waking everyone before dawn with its cries. Another about the way it examined a pocket watch with tiny, serious hands. A complaint about ruined curtains. A fond remark about an unexpected moment of gentleness. A small body curling up against the arm of a chair on a long evening. These documents, where they survive, show the complexity of the relationships that formed in the shadow of the craze, neither wholly sentimental nor entirely exploitative, but a shifting mixture of affection, inconvenience, and misunderstanding. There were also voices that condemned the practice more directly, though they did not always carry far. Editorials argued that wild animals should remain in their natural habitats, or at least in institutions equipped to care for them properly. Religious leaders, in some cases, framed the keeping of monkeys as a sign of vanity and moral confusion, a distraction from more serious duties. Advocates for the poor pointed out that money spent on exotic pets might better be used to improve living conditions for the humans already struggling to survive in overcrowded neighborhoods. Against these critiques stood the quieter but persistent force of habit. Once an animal had been bought and brought home, it was not easily unbought. Its presence raised practical questions that did not lend themselves to simple moral answers. An owner who had come to feel genuine attachment might hesitate to surrender the animal to a dealer or institution of uncertain reputation. Even those who had grown tired of the burden might find it difficult to decide on a course of action that did not involve some form of abandonment or sale. So the monkeys remained for a while longer than the fashion that had made them desirable. They swung from chairbacks and peered out of windows even as the newspapers turned their attention elsewhere. They left faint marks on the lives of the people who fed them, scolded them, and, in some cases, mourned them when their small bodies failed under the strain of an environment never meant for them. The memory of the craze would later seem compressed, as if it had happened almost all at once, In reality, it unfolded over a series of months and years, diffusing through neighborhoods at different speeds and intensities. In some streets, the sight of a monkey at a window became briefly familiar. In others, it never appeared at all. The city was too large and varied for any trend to cover it evenly. What remained consistent beneath all the variation was the pattern of longing and misalignment. People reached for something they believed would make their lives more interesting, more remarkable, more fully modern. They chose a symbol of that desire in the form of a living animal whose needs they could not fully meet. The result was a kind of ongoing negotiation between expectation and reality, carried out in cramped rooms and stairwells, in whispered conversations and small domestic accidents. When historians would later write about New York in these years, they focused on the larger transformations: urban reform, technological advance, waves of immigration, the shifting balance of power between capital and labor. The monkey craze rarely appeared in these accounts except as an oddity. Yet within its narrow frame, it contained in miniature many of the same tensions that defined the era: the push and pull between spectacle and responsibility, between possession and care, between a city's desire to be connected to the wider world and its limited capacity to absorb what that connection brought to its doorstep. In some parts of the city, the craze left its most visible mark not in homes, but in places where people gathered to be entertained. Theaters and music halls, always eager for a new way to draw a crowd, occasionally borrowed the presence of small primates to spice up an evening's program. A poster pasted to a brick wall might show a smiling performer holding a monkey in a little jacket, promising comic interludes between songs and skits. Inside, the animal's brief appearances became part of the spectacle of modern life: electric lights, popular tunes, and, as an added curiosity, a creature from another continent hopping nervously from prop to prop. Vaudeville stages, already a patchwork of acts stitched together by nothing more than timing and applause, absorbed these animals as easily as they had absorbed dancers, jugglers, and magicians. For some performers, incorporating a monkey into the act seemed like an easy way to keep pace with the fashion of the moment. Trainers worked hurriedly in back rooms and rented yards, coaxing simple tricks from creatures that were as likely to improvise as to obey. A bow here, a salute there, a piece of fruit accepted from a stranger's hand under the hot glare of stage lamps. The audience responded with the same blend of reactions seen elsewhere: laughter, surprise, discomfort, fascination. Some viewers cheered at the sight of a monkey scampering across the stage, while others studied the animal's anxious movements with a tightening in the chest that had nothing to do with amusement. The creature's presence turned the stage into a mirror, reflecting the city's attitudes back at itself: delight in novelty, indifference to origins, a tendency to overlook the cost of entertainment when that cost was borne by someone or something else. Even outside formal stages, the monkey craze colored street life in small ways. Along certain busy thoroughfares, organ grinders and street musicians found that an animal perched on a shoulder or clutching a small tin cup could increase their earnings. The sight of a monkey, dressed in a scrap of bright cloth, its eyes darting in all directions, drew attention that a human performer alone might not. Coins clinked more readily into a cup, held by a small hand, even when the hand trembled with cold or fear. These scenes blurred the line between fashion and survival. For some, the monkey was a decorative indulgence. For others, it was equipment, a tool for scraping together a little extra money. In both cases, the animals were pulled into human purposes they had never chosen. Their own needs and instincts receded behind the stories people told about them. That they were clever, that they were comical, that they were almost like little people. Those stories made it easier to forget the forests and families left far behind. At the edges of official concern, there were scattered attempts to tally the presence of such animals in the city. A clerk in an office tasked with drafting a report on urban nuisances might add a brief line referencing complaints about exotic pets. A charitable organization surveying conditions in tenement districts could note the existence of monkeys in some households, categorizing them as one more symptom of overcrowding and misplaced priorities. These mentions, sparse and easily overlooked, hinted at a city struggling to understand how far its responsibilities extended. The idea of responsibility itself was shifting. Conversations about animal welfare were gaining ground, influenced by campaigns against cruelty to horses and by the emergence of societies dedicated to humane treatment. Pamphlets distributed in public places urged kindness toward all living creatures, appealing to conscience as well as to the desire for respectability. In that climate, the image of a monkey chained to a radiator or confined to a cramped cage began to sit uneasily alongside the ideal of a civilized, progressive city. Yet change did not arrive in a straight line. Even as some voices called for stricter rules and greater compassion, others treated such concerns as sentimental distractions. The same newspapers that ran thoughtful editorials about the treatment of working animals also printed humorous sketches in which monkeys were portrayed as charming scoundrels, undeserving of sympathy because they cause so much trouble. This confusion of tones, serious and frivolous, outraged and amused, reflected the city's own divided feelings. The legal framework surrounding exotic animals during this time was patchwork at best. Some states and municipalities introduced ordinances limiting the keeping of certain species, but enforcement was uneven. Inspectors, already tasked with monitoring building safety, sanitation, and other pressing issues, had limited time to devote to checking whether a particular household harbored an unlicensed monkey. Complaints might prompt action in some cases, while in others they led only to a warning or a suggestion that the animal be kept out of sight. What truly eroded the craze, more than any single law or campaign, was the city's inexhaustible appetite for the next thing. As the first decade of the 20th century moved toward its close, new forms of entertainment and new symbols of modernity appeared. Motion pictures, still short and flickering, were beginning to take hold of the public imagination. Cars multiplied, their noise and smell adding new layers to the city's soundscape and scent. Aviation, remote and experimental, captured the headlines with feats of daring that made a monkey on a leash seem almost quaint. The attention that had once focused on the novelty of exotic pets drifted toward these emerging marvels. A dinner guest might be more eager to discuss the latest automobile accident or the opening of a new cinema than to comment on a monkey in the corner of the room. The animal, once a centerpiece, receded into the background, an expensive complication without the full reward of fascination it had once provided. As that shift unfolded, the human relationships built around these animals were forced to a kind of conclusion. Some owners, realizing that the fatigue and inconvenience outweighed the diminishing thrill, sought ways to relinquish their pets. A few were able to place them in informal collections or small private parks on the outskirts of the city, where space and relative quiet offered a somewhat better compromise. Others turned to dealers, accepting low offers that reflected a market already cooling. There were instances where monkeys were donated to zoological gardens, their personal histories dissolving into the broader narrative of institutional care. In those settings, the animals might have had more room and more specialized attention, though at the cost of becoming anonymous among many others. The individual story of a particular parlor or tenement room faded into the background once the creature was placed behind the bars of a public enclosure. For every case with such an ending, there were others that remained undocumented. Animals that sickened and died in cramped quarters. Creatures quietly released, against regulations and common sense, into environments where they could not survive. Stories passed among neighbors about someone who simply opened a window one night and watched an agile shape leap into the darkness, driven by equal parts guilt and desperation. The aftermath of the craze was not marked by a single moment of reckoning. Instead, the city absorbed the episode as it absorbed so many others, by folding it into the sediment of collective experience. People who had never owned or even seen a pet monkey still carried fragments of the phenomenon in their awareness, gleaned from reports and rumors. Those who had lived with the animals carried more vivid impressions, though they might speak of them rarely, uncertain how to explain why the experiment had seemed enticing in the first place. In quieter moments, when routine settled and the demands of daily life loosened their grip for an hour, some of these former owners no doubt thought back to their time with those small, intense creatures. The memory might come in the form of a sound, a faint echo of claws on wood, or the snap of a curtain rod quivering under sudden weight. It might appear as an image, a pair of eyes reflecting lamplight, a hand with too many joints, reaching confidently for a piece of fruit. These recollections could be tinged with regret or with a kind of fragile nostalgia. There were people who had never intended to be cruel, who had tried, within the limits of their understanding, to offer comfort and care. They might remember moments when the animals seemed to relax, when they played with improvised toys or settled against a human shoulder without tension. Those memories did not erase the larger wrongness of the arrangement, but they complicated it, reminding anyone who looked closely that the history of the monkey craze was not only a history of exploitation, but also one of incomplete, clumsy attempts at connection. The animals, for their part, left no written records. Their experience could only be reconstructed from the outside through the marks they left and the accounts of those who watched them. And yet, in imagining their perspective, a clearer picture emerges of what the craze truly meant. Not just a fashion, but a collision between different ways of living, superimposed for a brief time in the confined spaces of a growing city. As months turned into years and new events crowded the Chronicle of New York, references to monkeys as pets dwindled. The word craze attached itself to other phenomena: dances, songs, clothing styles. The monkeys of 1907 receded into the footnotes of memory, tucked among countless other details that gave the city its texture at that moment in time. Buildings changed hands, were renovated or demolished. Wallpaper bearing the ghostly imprints of small hands was stripped away, replaced by fresh patterns that knew nothing of what had happened before. Wooden floors were sanded and polished, erasing scratches that had once traced tiny, looping paths from window to chair to table. Cages were dismantled and repurposed, their bars bent to new shapes in workshops where the sound of hammering drowned out any lingering echoes. Yet in the layered history of the city, the monkey craze remained as a thin, distinct stratum. It was a reminder that even in eras remembered for grand struggles and sweeping changes, lives were also shaped by smaller, stranger choices. A decision made in a pet shop on a whim, a moment of hesitation in front of a newspaper advertisement, a fleeting sense that owning something wild and foreign might make an ordinary existence feel more remarkable. Those choices, multiplied across a city of millions, created a brief period in which the sight of a monkey in a New York window or on a New York street was not unimaginable. The fact that such a period could exist at all said something about the restless character of the place, a city forever reaching outward, forever pulling distant things into its orbit, and only belatedly reckoning with the consequences. In that sense, the story of the 1907 New York monkey craze was not really a story about monkeys alone. It was a story about a moment when a rapidly changing world treated living beings as novelties in the same way it treated new gadgets and fashions. It was about the gap between what people thought they were buying, a bit of excitement, a talking point, a symbol of sophistication, and what they actually brought into their homes, a complex, sensitive creature whose needs could not be neatly folded into the rhythms of urban life. When the craze subsided, the city moved on, as it always did. But the pattern it revealed, of fascination flowering into possession, of possession curdling into inconvenience, of responsibility trailing far behind desire, would reappear in different forms, with different objects and different lives at stake in the decades to come. In the quieter neighborhoods, just beyond the city's most crowded streets, the monkey craze left traces that were easier to overlook, but no less real. On a tree-lined block, where the houses stood a little farther apart and the sidewalks were swept more often, a row of brownstones absorbed the fashion in their own restrained way. Behind one of those facades, a family that prided itself on being up to date decided, for a time, that a monkey belonged alongside their upright piano and their set of encyclopedias. The animal arrived in a crate one afternoon, when the light slanted gently across the polished steps. A driver carried it up to the door, the wood knocking softly against his knees with each step. Inside, the house smelled faintly of beeswax and coal, the result of regular cleaning and careful attention to fire. Curtains filtered the light into a soft glow that made the furniture seem heavier, more permanent than it really was. When the crate was opened in the front parlor, the world within that house changed slightly. Cushions that had sat undisturbed for years became potential launching pads. The delicate fringe of a lampshade transformed into a tempting tassel. The monkey, blinking against the change from dimness to patterned wallpaper, moved with sudden bursts of speed and equally sudden freezes, as if unsure whether this new world was a threat or a puzzle. Family members watched with a mixture of pride and unease. The older generation stood near the doorway, hands folded, making polite remarks about how strange it was to see such a creature so far from its native forest. The younger ones edged closer, drawn by the animal's quickness and apparent intelligence. They laughed when it grabbed for buttons or reached curiously toward a necklace, then fell silent when it knocked a porcelain figurine from a shelf. Over the weeks that followed, the family's relationship to the monkey settled into a pattern. Guests were shown the animal early in the evening, when everyone's patience was still wide and untested. The host or hostess would gesture toward a perch near the window or a favored chair back, inviting their visitors to admire the exotic pet. Laughter and questions followed, the same ones in nearly every conversation. What does it eat? Where did it come from? Does it understand commands? As the night wore on, the tone shifted. Small mishaps accumulated. A glass was tipped, a cufflink snatched, a piece of embroidery pulled loose by curious fingers. The monkey, overstimulated by unfamiliar scents and sounds, grew more unpredictable. It would dart from one vantage point to another, eyes bright and restless, heart beating too fast beneath its thin chest. Eventually, someone would suggest that it might be best to remove the animal to another room for its own peace and for the safety of fragile objects. In that back room, away from the polished conversations and careful laughter, the monkey's world shrank. It sat on the back of a worn chair or clung to the bars of a smaller cage, listening to the muffled murmur of voices beyond the door. The smell of food drifted in, along with the faint clink of cutlery, but the animal itself was no longer part of the display. It became, in those hours, a complication set aside so that the evening could proceed without incident. On another street, not far away, but a world apart in atmosphere, a tenement building held a different version of the same story. Here, the stairwells smelled of cooking, damp laundry, and the sharp traces of coal dust carried in on boots. Children's voices filled the air at odd hours, depending on when their parents worked. Doors opened and shut with a frequency that turned privacy into a rare luxury. In one of the smaller apartments, a monkey lived in a corner cage near the single window. Its presence was the result of a decision made in a moment of optimism by someone who believed that a performing animal might help supplement meager wages. The creature's tricks were simple but effective: a hesitant little bow, a turn in place, the ability to hold a small object and raise it toward a passerby in silent appeal. On good days, when the streets were busy and the weather allowed for extended time outdoors, the monkey's skills did bring in a few extra coins. But the rest of its life unfolded in that cramped corner. During long stretches when there was no time to take it out, or no one free to watch it, the animal paced and clung and stared. Its cage was cleaned as circumstances allowed. Scraps of cloth and straw provided some softness, but the space was still too small for full stretches, for leaps and arcs of movement. Children watched it with a mixture of fascination and impatience, banging on the bars despite warnings, seeking some response to break the monotony of days shaped by adult concerns. Neighbors heard the monkey, whether they wanted to or not. Its sharper calls cut through the building's usual noise, threading between the sounds of arguments, lullabies, and coughs. Some residents accepted this as just one more layer in the city's unending symphony. Others resented the intrusion, grumbling about lost sleep or frightened babies, wondering aloud why anyone would bring such a creature into a place where even human children barely had room to move. The building's landlord heard those complaints and weighed them against his own priorities. Rent owed, repairs postponed, the balancing act of keeping enough tenants to cover costs without letting disorder drive others away. The monkey's presence became a small bargaining chip in conversations about payments and rules. Threats to force its removal hung in the air, sometimes carried out, sometimes forgotten in the press of more immediate problems. Across the city, In a shop not far from a busy market, another kind of compromise took shape. The shop specialized in birds and small mammals, its narrow aisles filled with cages suspended from the ceiling and stacked carefully along the walls. Canaries, finches, and parakeets made up most of the stock, their songs and movements creating a bright, fluttering atmosphere that drew customers in from the street. Among them, for a time, a single monkey remained unsold. It had been part of the earlier wave, one more animal brought in when demand seemed to be growing. But by the time it arrived, the crest of the craze had already begun to sag. Customers, who might once have lingered in front of its cage, now paused only briefly before drifting toward safer, simpler purchases. A bird was less trouble than a monkey. A hamster, a rabbit, or a dog carried fewer unknowns. The shopkeeper continued to feed and water the animal, cleaning its cage in the same methodical way he tended to the others. Yet he could not avoid doing mental arithmetic each time he looked at it. The space it occupied, the food it consumed, the risk it posed if it bit a customer or fell ill. He lowered the price incrementally, hoping that someone would take a chance. But each week that passed without a buyer made it harder to imagine a comfortable resolution. In the meanwhile, the monkey watched the rhythm of the shop with a gaze that missed little. It saw children pressing their noses to the glass, adults stepping briskly inside with specific intentions and leaving with boxes or cages covered in cloth. It tracked the movements of the broom as the floor was swept, the way the sunlight shifted across the front window during the day. Its fingers explored every part of its enclosure, learning the texture of metal and wood as thoroughly as others of its kind had once learned the patterns of bark and vine. As these individual scenes unfolded in different corners of New York, the monkey craze as a named phenomenon was already fading from public discourse. The phrase appeared less frequently in print. New topics crowded it out. Yet in parlors, tenements, and shops, the after effects persisted. Animals remained where fashion had placed them, and people navigated the consequences of choices made amid earlier excitement. Taken together, these scattered lives formed a map of the city's brief infatuation. In affluent homes, the monkeys became private secrets, sources of embarrassment or quiet affection, depending on how circumstances unfolded. In overcrowded buildings, they became one more strain on already stretched resources. In commercial spaces, they were inventory that had outlived its peak profitability. Caught between the logic of markets and the stubborn fact of being alive, the city held all of this at once. Its streets and walls, indifferent to individual dramas, enclosed countless such stories in the same square mile. A passerby could walk from a block where a monkey watched the world from a bay window to another, where a similar animal clung to the bars of a street performer's cage, and then turn a corner into a street where no trace of the craze had ever appeared. The phenomenon was never evenly distributed, only loosely stitched across the urban fabric. By the time the last of the monkeys associated with the 1907 craze had vanished from those rooms and cages, the city had grown used to other distractions. The animal's absence did not leave a visible gap in the skyline or on the maps. Instead, it left a subtler hollow in the memory of those who had shared space with them. Over the years, those memories softened at the edges, their sharper details worn down by retelling or by silence. A person might recall, vaguely, that there had once been a monkey in the house when they were a child, though they could not quite remember its name or how it had come to be there. Another might remember the weight of a small body on their shoulder during long days on the street, the way it shifted when startled by a sudden noise. Someone else might remember only the sound, a thin, piping call cutting through the deeper hum of the city, startling birds on a rooftop or dogs in a yard. These recollections, dispersed and incomplete, form the lasting human record of the craze, layered over the faint physical traces left in buildings and objects. They anchored the episode not in public proclamations or official accounts, but in the quiet, private spaces where people and animals had tried, for a brief time, to share a life designed for one and not the other. Far from New York, in port cities that fed the arteries of global trade, the monkey craze of 1907 had its roots in landscapes that looked nothing like brick canyons and trolley lines. Along muddy riverbanks and in patches of thinning forest, the work of capturing animals for export had already been going on for years before anyone in Manhattan thought of a monkey as a fashionable companion. Local hunters, guides, and middlemen moved through these environments with a knowledge passed down through generations, now bent toward a purpose that reached thousands of miles away. The techniques used to obtain monkeys varied, but they shared a basic principle: take advantage of curiosity and social bonds. Simple snares baited with fruit, cages disguised with leaves, nets thrown over branches where small bodies gathered to sleep. Sometimes a mother was killed so that her infant, clinging to her even as life left her body, could be pried loose and carried away. At other times, whole groups were chased toward traps, confusion and fear breaking the cohesion that had once offered safety in numbers. In every case, the capture process fractured the social structure that, in the wild, anchored a monkey's life. Once taken, the animals passed into a chain of custody that stripped their journeys of individual detail. They were gathered in temporary holding areas where the smell of damp earth and crushed vegetation mixed with the sharper scents of fear and unfamiliar foods. Some died there, their bodies disposed of quietly, written off as expected losses. Those that survived were selected, sorted, and packed into crates that would carry them to ports, where the scale of commerce widened beyond any horizon they could have imagined. In crowded harbors serving imperial networks, warehouses held all manner of goods destined for Europe and North America. Rubber, coffee, timber, minerals, and spices filled most of the space. In corners and along walls stood cages and crates with live cargo. Birds with bright feathers dulled by stress, reptiles coiled in sullen knots, small mammals pressed against one another for warmth and reassurance. The monkeys to be sent on to New York were only a fraction of this living inventory, but they embodied the same logic. They were assets, measured in units and value, their eventual homes irrelevant to the ledgers that recorded them. Steamships, symbols of industrial power and global connection, became temporary worlds unto themselves once the animals were loaded on board. Deep in the hold, far from the polished decks where passengers strolled and dined, the monkeys lived in semi-darkness. The air was heavy with the odors of coal, oil, damp wood, and the close press of many bodies, human and non-human. Water sloshed in containers as the ship rolled. Chains rattled. The occasional beam of light cutting through a hatch revealed glimpses of fur, eyes, grasping hands, testing the limits of confinement. Sailors responsible for this cargo were not generally trained as animal caretakers. Their main task was to keep the animals alive long enough to reach their destination, and they did so with whatever means were available amid the demands of the voyage. Buckets of water, scraps of food, hurried checks for obvious illness. There were no veterinarians on hand, no quiet spaces for recovery. The journey itself culled the weak, leaving only those whose bodies could withstand the unnatural conditions of sustained confinement under constant motion. For the monkeys, the crossing represented a severing as complete as it was incomprehensible. Sounds became unfamiliar. The thrum of engines, the crash of waves against metal, the muffled shouts of men. Smells shifted from the complex tapestry of a forest to a limited palette of oil, salt, and waste. Days and nights lost their old meaning. The sun, when visible through grates or hatches, offered only fragmented hints of passing time. The individuals that would later appear in New York pet shops and private parlors arrived already bearing the invisible scars of this dislocation. When the ship pulled into New York Harbor, the animals became part of a spectacle that belonged to the city's own self-image. The skyline, pierced by the masts of other vessels and the cranes of cargo operations, stood as a testament to industrial ambition. Floating in the water, the ship represented a stream of wealth and novelty flowing toward the metropolis. Newspapers wrote about tonnage and tariffs, about imports vital to factories and homes. Somewhere in the dense columns of such reports, or in the paperwork never intended for public view, the presence of monkeys was acknowledged in a few spare words. Customs inspections focused on contraband, declared value and adherence to regulations more concerned with revenue than with ethics. Crates containing animals might be examined to ensure that nothing of greater economic significance was hidden within them. Officials with other priorities passed by the flicker of dark eyes peering through slats, the quick movement of fingers against wood, without comment. In documents, the animals were reduced to categories and numbers. Their age, sex, and species became details relevant only to pricing and risk calculations. From the docks, the monkeys were moved into the city's interior, often under cover of darkness, or in the early morning, when fewer eyes followed wagons and carts. The route they traveled sometimes took them past neighborhoods, where, in a matter of weeks or months, they would reappear transformed, no longer anonymous cargo, but named pets displayed to friends and neighbors. Between origin and destination, the continuity lay in their status as commodities. Hands changed, accents changed, languages changed, but the frame through which most people understood the animals remained essentially transactional. Middlemen, importers, and dealers negotiated in cramped offices above or behind storefronts. Their rooms smelled of ink, tobacco, and the faint traces of the creatures that passed through their ledgers and, occasionally, through adjacent holding spaces. Conversations balanced risk and opportunity. How much demand could the current craze sustain? How many animals could be sold before oversaturation drove down prices or drew unwanted attention from regulators and reformers? Decisions made in those rooms shaped how many monkeys would end up in the city's homes at any given time. The arrival of each new batch refreshed the supply for pet shops and private buyers alike. Some of the animals went directly to established collectors and institutions, bypassing the public market. Others were distributed across a network of retailers that ranged from specialized bird and animal shops to more general stores that kept a few exotic species as conversation pieces to draw customers in. In these settings, the monkeys' earlier experiences were invisible, their histories overwritten by new narratives crafted for potential purchasers. Shopkeepers learned how to talk about them. They emphasized intelligence, charm, and the possibility of teaching tricks. They downplayed or glossed over the unpredictability, the strength that belied the animal's small size, the difficulty of meeting their social and physical needs in human homes. For customers in search of novelty, the pitch was compelling. A monkey was more than a pet. It was a symbol of connection to a wider world, a sign of being in touch with emerging fashions, a topic for conversation and storytelling. In department stores and fancy emporiums, the influence of the craze appeared more subtly. Window displays featured mannequins in the latest attire, posed beside painted backdrops of exotic scenes, sometimes including stylized images of tropical animals. Advertisements invoked the thrill of the foreign, suggesting that one could bring a hint of far-off places into everyday life through objects, decor, and, for those inclined to go further, living creatures. The monkey craze did not exist in isolation. It was part of a broader cultural current that turned colonial reach into domestic ornament. Behind all of this, largely unseen by those who bought and sold the animals in New York, lived the people in the regions of origin who experienced the trade's effects in daily, practical terms. They knew the forests, the habits of the animals, the changes in local populations over time. Some profited from the work of capturing and supplying monkeys, integrating it into a broader economy of hunting and gathering. Others saw in it a troubling shift, a sign that creatures once regarded as part of the living fabric of their environment were being turned into export goods whose fate lay entirely beyond their knowledge. In this way, the 1907 monkey craze tied together places and lives that would never otherwise have intersected. The restlessness of a city seeking new forms of entertainment and display pulled on threads that ran through dockside warehouses, shipholds, rural villages, and forest edges. The small bodies that ended up in New York apartments and tenements were the final link in a chain that began with decisions made in boardrooms and colonial administrations, in trading posts and local markets scattered across oceans. The people who later tired of their monkeys, who watched them grow sick or unruly in environments they could not possibly have been designed for, rarely traced that chain backward. Their regret or frustration unfolded within the confines of their own circumstances. A broken vase, a frightened child, a landlord's complaint. Yet embedded in every such moment was the weight of all that had gone before, intangible but real. The monkeys carried those histories with them, even when no one was looking closely enough to see the burden. Within the social fabric of New York, the monkey craze intersected with questions of class, gender, and identity in ways that revealed as much about human aspirations as about the animals themselves. For some members of the city's elite and aspiring middle classes, owning a monkey offered a new way to signal taste, modernity, and cosmopolitanism. The choice of pet became part of an ongoing performance in which every object, every garment, and every aspect of the home interior contributed to a carefully curated image. Hostesses who prided themselves on being at the forefront of fashion might introduce a monkey into their parlors alongside imported furniture, fine china, and art prints sourced from Europe. The animal, perched on a stand, or allowed to move cautiously among selected guests, fit into a narrative in which the home served as a showcase of worldliness. Visitors were expected not only to admire the decor, but also to appreciate the subtle message. This was a household with access to the latest trends, to goods and experiences drawn from far beyond the city's limits. Magazines aimed at these readers reinforced the association. In illustrations accompanying articles on modern living, monkeys and other exotic animals sometimes appeared as accessories, their presence taken as a sign that the inhabitants of such rooms were not bound by provincial tastes. While not ubiquitous, these images contributed to a sense that embracing the unusual, even when it took the form of a restless, demanding creature, was a mark of distinction. The same publications that advised on which fabrics to choose for drapes and which colors best suited a particular season might, in a few lines, mention the charming companion a small primate could provide. Gendered expectations wove through these depictions. Women were often shown as the principal human figures interacting with the animals. Their poise and composure contrasted with the monkey's impulsive antics. The implied message was that a truly modern woman could maintain control and grace even in the presence of unpredictable elements, whether those elements took the form of social changes, new technologies, or an animal that might, at any moment, snatch a ribbon from her hair. At the same time, men were depicted as the providers of such novelties, the ones whose financial and social reach made the acquisition of exotic pets possible. In practice, the labor of actually managing the animals frequently fell to domestic servants, many of whom had little say in whether a monkey entered the household. Maids, nannies, and cooks bore the brunt of the additional work, cleaning up messes, soothing frightened children, intercepting small disasters before they could ruin expensive furnishings. Their experiences rarely appeared in the polished narratives of magazines and social columns, but they formed a crucial part of the lived reality of the craze. Servants swapped stories in kitchens and back corridors about houses where monkeys had gnawed through curtain cords, stolen food from plates, or bitten hands, reaching to remove them from forbidden places. Some developed techniques for coaxing the animals into calmer states, using familiar objects or tones of voice. Others simply endured the chaos, adding it to the list of indignities accepted as part of employment. Their perspectives highlighted the gap between the symbolic function of the animals in displays of status and the practical difficulties of incorporating them into daily routines. In middle-class households without live-in staff, the division of labor took on a different shape. Women who already balanced domestic responsibilities with limited leisure found themselves caring for an animal that demanded more time and attention than a traditional pet. Feeding, cleaning, monitoring the monkey's movements, repairing damage. All of this added to workloads that were often invisible outside the home. Enthusiasm for the novelty could fade quickly when confronted with the tedium of constant supervision and the strain of explaining mishaps to visitors or landlords. Children occupied a particular position in this landscape. For many, monkeys were objects of fascination, embodiments of a world beyond the city's familiar grid of streets and tenements. Parents who could afford such a pet sometimes framed its presence as educational, a way to expose their offspring to nature and science. Picture books and school lessons about distant lands and their wildlife reinforce this notion, making the animal a living illustration of topics encountered in print. At the same time, the monkey's quick movements and unpredictable behaviors could provoke fear as easily as wonder. The question of discipline extended from human children to the non-human newcomers. Adults debated how strictly a monkey should be controlled, whether it should be allowed relative freedom within the home or confined to a cage except on special occasions. In these conversations, ideas about authority, obedience, and the proper ordering of the household surfaced in ways that mirrored broader social anxieties. A monkey that failed to learn its place could be read as a sign of lax management, just as a child who misbehaved might be seen as evidence of flawed parenting. Outside the domestic sphere, the presence of monkeys in public and semi-public spaces raised questions about respectability and taste. A person walking down a well-trafficked avenue with a primate on a leash or perched on a shoulder inevitably drew attention. Some onlookers were impressed, others offended. What for one observer signaled daring and modern flair might for another represent vulgarity or a disregard for social norms. The same act could be interpreted either as charming or as a bid for attention too transparent to be admired. These divergent reactions often followed class lines. In neighborhoods where rent was high and manners tightly policed, the sight of a monkey on the street might prompt complaints couched in language about safety and hygiene, but rooted partly in the desire to maintain a certain image of the area. In more mixed districts, the animal's presence could be accepted as just one more oddity in a city already overflowing with them, though not without muttered comments about priorities and propriety. Ethnic and cultural differences also shaped responses. Immigrant communities brought their own traditions of animal keeping and their own interpretations of what the presence of a monkey might signify. For some, the sight evoked memories of markets or villages where such creatures lived on the margins of human settlements, scavenging and occasionally causing mischief. For others, it was simply one more inexplicable feature of a new environment whose habits and fashions were still being deciphered. These varied perspectives further complicated any simple narrative about the craze's meaning. The language used to describe the monkeys in conversation reflected underlying attitudes. Terms like mischievous and impish softened the reality of stress and confinement, turning behaviors rooted in fear or frustration into charming quirks. Comparing monkeys to children reinforced a sense of familiarity while obscuring the profound differences in need and perception. Jokes about little gentlemen in coats and hats, about tiny clowns performing tricks for guests, added a layer of humor that made it easier to ignore moments when the animal's distress broke through the comedic frame. At the same time, there were instances where these comparisons unsettled as much as they amused. Observers attuned to questions of race and hierarchy could not miss the way simian imagery had long been used to dehumanize certain groups of people, particularly in the context of colonial rule and racial caricature. The presence of actual monkeys in fashionable homes and public amusements sat uneasily alongside this history, even when it was not explicitly acknowledged. Satirists and critics occasionally hinted at the connections, using the craze as a vehicle to comment on the moral contradictions of an empire-minded society. Thus, the 1907 monkey craze functioned not only as a fad of ownership, but as a prism through which existing social dynamics were refracted. The decision to acquire a monkey, the ways of displaying or concealing it, the stories told about its behavior. All these choices intersected with class aspirations, gender roles, cultural identities, and unspoken hierarchies. The animals themselves became entangled in these human concerns, their own needs subordinated to the symbolic roles they were made to play. When the fashion waned, the symbolic weight did not disappear entirely. Memories of the craze influenced later debates about which animals belonged in domestic spaces and on city streets. The association between exotic pets and ostentatious display persisted, coloring how subsequent generations viewed similar phenomena. Even as specific details faded, the image of a monkey perched nervously in a parlor or scrambling along a balcony railing remained lodged in the cultural imagination, a reminder of how far a desire to be seen as modern and sophisticated had once led otherwise practical people. The rhythms of daily life in New York shaped and were shaped by the presence of monkeys in ways that rarely made headlines but deeply affected the households involved. Morning light slipped around buildings at sharp angles, revealing through half-drawn curtains glimpses of small figures moving restlessly in their confined worlds. In some apartments, an animal greeted the start of each day with urgent calls, reacting to changes in light and noise with a sensitivity that seemed at odds with the sluggishness of its human companions, still shaking off sleep. Breakfast routines adjusted to accommodate these demands. A bowl or dish set aside on a counter, filled with fruit scraps or leftover bread, marked the place of the monkey in the domestic order. In meticulous homes, the process was handled with almost ceremonial care, the food arranged and the cage inspected before anyone sat down at the family table. In more chaotic settings, feeding was squeezed into already cramped schedules, performed hastily between preparing children for school and catching trolley cars to work. Sounds carried differently in buildings with monkeys. The soft clink of cage bars, the occasional thud of an object knocked from a shelf, the quick patter of feet along windowsills. These noises became part of the background for those who lived with them, as familiar as the creak of floorboards or the ticking of clocks. Neighbors, overhearing only fragments, sometimes misinterpreted them, imagining arguments or accidents where there were none. Confusion and curiosity fed rumors, giving the craze an aura of mystery larger than its actual scale. Afternoons, when many adults were away, left monkeys alone with the changing light and the muffled vibrations of activity from outside. In rooms that faced busy streets, the animals watched traffic and pedestrians with a vigilance born of boredom. Children returning from school sometimes raced upstairs, fueled by the expectation of interaction with the household's unusual resident, lingering by cages to make faces, offer contraband treats, or simply stare in silence. For them, the monkey was both entertainment and a kind of silent confidant, present when parents were not. Schoolyards amplified the craze in their own way. Stories about who had seen a monkey, who lived in a building where one was kept, who had been allowed to touch or feed it, circulated with the intensity of gossip about games and minor scandals. The animals became tokens in a social economy of boasting and exclusion. A child whose family owned such a pet occupied a brief position of prominence, fielding questions and invitations from classmates eager to share in the experience. At the same time, they carried the burden of describing and justifying an arrangement that even they might have found confusing. Evenings brought another layer of adjustment. Families reunited around tables or stoves, while the monkey responded to the influx of movement and sound with renewed activity. Visitors arriving for dinner or tea confronted the question of how to greet the animal, whether to treat it as a novelty to be touched and teased, or as a presence to be acknowledged politely from a distance. Social etiquette, already complicated by differences of class, culture, and temperament, now had to accommodate a being that did not adhere to any human code. In quieter moments, When lamps were turned low and the city's noise dropped to a softer murmur, the gap between human and animal experience could feel paradoxically narrower. A monkey curled into itself on a perch or within a blanket might appear almost peaceful, its breathing slowing, its small frame rising and falling in rhythm with the unseen hearts of those nearby. People watching such scenes sometimes reported a sense of connection that transcended the practical and symbolic functions the animal had been assigned. In those instances, the craze's abstract questions about fashion and responsibility dissolved into something more intimate, the simple fact of sharing shelter and warmth across species lines. But such moments did not erase the ongoing friction caused by the mismatch between the monkey's needs and their environment. Behavioral problems that owners described as stubbornness or mischief often reflected deeper distress. Animals deprived of social companionship from their own kind turned to repetitive motions, pacing along the same few inches of space or rocking back and forth for long stretches. Those that received inconsistent or harsh discipline grew skittish, flinching at sudden movements, their eyes darting to every sound. Some people responded to these signs with impatience, interpreting them as defiance. Others, moved by intuition or advice, tried to enrich the animals' lives with extra toys, more varied food, or adjustments to cages that allowed for slightly expanded movement. Homemade climbing structures appeared in a few apartments, ropes stretched between heavy pieces of furniture, old sheets repurposed as hammocks. These improvisations rarely fully met the monkey's needs, but they indicated an effort, however limited, to acknowledge that the creatures were more than decorations. The difficulties of veterinary care added another layer of strain. The field of animal medicine was still developing, and practitioners who specialized in household pets were accustomed primarily to treating dogs and cats. Monkeys presented unfamiliar problems, different anatomies, different diseases, different reactions to stress and injury. Owners seeking help found that some veterinarians were unwilling or unable to treat their animals, citing lack of expertise or resources. Others did their best, drawing on general knowledge of physiology and infection, but outcomes were uncertain. Illness and death brought the contradictions of the craze into sharp relief. A monkey that had once been a source of pride and entertainment became, in sickness, a mirror of the limits of human control. Families sat awake through the night, listening to labored breathing or restless movements from cages that had once symbolized novelty and status. Children asked difficult questions about suffering and fairness. Adults, confronted with the consequences of choices made in more carefree moods, grappled with guilt and helplessness. What to do with a dead monkey, once the end had come, was not always straightforward. Disposal could not follow the rituals reserved for human bodies, nor the simple habits attached to smaller, more common pets. In some cases, animals were buried in small, improvised graves in yards or vacant lots, their resting places marked with stones or scraps of wood. In more densely built areas, other, less ceremonial solutions were found, guided by practicality rather than sentiment. The physical trace of an individual life disappeared into soil, ash, or landfill, even as the memory of its presence lingered in those who had known it. Within tenement districts, these cycles of acquisition, adaptation, and loss unfolded against a backdrop of constant instability. Families moved frequently, forced by rising rents, evictions, or changes in employment. A monkey might be part of a household in one building for a few months before circumstances drove its owners to leave it behind, sell it, or attempt to bring it along to conditions even less suitable. Landlords and neighbors, already juggling overcrowding and scarce resources, weighed their tolerance for such pets against the need to maintain some semblance of order. In fancier quarters, the same processes played out with more cushioning but similar patterns. Changes in fortune, shifting social circles, new interests, all could render a monkey surplus to requirements. The animal that had once helped define a household's cutting-edge modernity became, in these cases, an awkward reminder of a passing enthusiasm. Decisions about its fate were shaped not only by practicality and affection, but also by concerns about reputation. To admit that the craze had been a mistake was to acknowledge fallibility in the realm of taste, something those invested in status were often reluctant to do. Across these varied settings, the 1907 monkey craze altered the texture of everyday life in myriad small ways. It introduced new sounds and smells into buildings already dense with sensory input. It rearranged routines, budgets, and emotional landscapes. It prompted conversations about responsibility and cruelty, sometimes framing them around specific instances of harm, sometimes allowing them to hover unspoken behind the eyes of those who watched a restless animal pace a confined space. In doing so, it revealed how porous the boundaries were between public trends and private lives, between distant markets and intimate choices, between the abstract desire for novelty and the concrete realities of care. Years later, when the details of 1907 had softened into the general notion of the early years of the century, the monkey craze lingered mostly in traces so faint they were almost imaginary. A brittle newspaper clipping folded into the back of a family Bible, its ink browned and fading, mentioning a commotion caused by an ill-tempered simian in an uptown street. A photograph in which, if the corner was studied closely enough, a small shape could be seen on a balcony rail, half hidden behind a potted plant. A line in an old letter describing a visit to a house where the strangest pet sat watching us from the curtain pole. For those who had lived through the craze, recollection came and went like a draft under a door. An elderly woman, sitting by a window on a winter afternoon decades later, might pause in her knitting as some faint sound in the street triggered a memory she could not quite name. A light, skittering movement, a flash of movement at the edge of vision. A retired policeman telling stories in a bar where the light was low and the air smelled of old wood and smoke might suddenly remember the morning he had coaxed a shaking, terrified animal down from a rooftop with a crust of bread, long after he had forgotten the names of most of the people he had arrested. In the official histories, the episode rarely earned more than a passing mention. It slipped into paragraphs about changing fashions, or was tucked into discussions of animal welfare movements as a curious, slightly embarrassing illustration. The focus of such accounts rested on larger, more visible transformations: the expansion of the subway, the rise of skyscrapers, the churn of labor struggles and political reform. Against that backdrop, a few dozen or a few hundred monkeys in private homes seemed almost too small to trouble the page. Yet the story remained, quiet and persistent, in the spaces between what was recorded and what was lived. It lay in the difference between the idea of a city and the reality of life inside its walls. On paper, New York, in the first decade of the 20th century, could be described in terms of population, industry, infrastructure. In memory, it was also a place where, for a brief period, the line between the domestic and the wild blurred in a strangely intimate way, not in jungles of brick and metaphor, but in real rooms with real animals that did not understand where they had been taken. The monkeys themselves were gone by then, their individual lives completed and folded into the larger pattern that had carried them from forests to ships to cages and rooms, and, in some cases, to quiet corners of public collections. What they left behind was not only a few scratches and bent bits of metal, but a subtle mark on the conscience of a growing city, a reminder that novelty and power over other beings could not be separated from responsibility without leaving a bruise, however small, on the deeper sense of what it meant to be modern. As the years passed, other crazes rose and fell. New animals, new technologies, new entertainment cycled through the attention of the city. People looked back on earlier fashions with a mixture of amusement and disbelief, wondering how anyone could have thought such things sensible. In such moments, the monkey craze of 1907 settled into its final place. Not a grand turning point, but a quiet example of how far a fleeting desire for something unusual could reach into the lives of those least able to resist it. Somewhere, in the layered imagination that clings to old cities, there remained an image that did not quite fade. A narrow hallway in a tall building, a closed door murmuring with sounds that did not belong to pipes or radiators or human voices. Behind it, a small creature curled into itself on a makeshift bed, one hand still resting on the worn wood of a perch, eyes half closed against the unfamiliar cold. Outside, carriages and early automobiles passed beneath street lamps, and people hurried home without knowing that just a few steps above their heads, a piece of another world was waiting out the night. In time, that image, too, slipped away, becoming no more than another faint color in the long painted scroll of the city's past. The craze had come and gone, leaving its thin, distinct line in the sediment of years, a quiet ripple under the louder waves of history. What remained was the understanding, as delicate and easily overlooked as a print of small fingers on glass, that even the briefest fashions can leave living beings caught in their wake, and that the stories told about a place are never quite complete without the odd, small chapters that once seemed hardly worth noticing at all.